Hey everybody, I'm Ahmad. I'm here with attorney Martino at Honos Law, doing our weekly call about business law and pertinent issues around that. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. So today we want to talk about employment policies and practices that make you rest easy. I want to know, well, we want to know, do you need employee manuals?
Well, the short answer to that question is yes. And I'm going to elaborate further, but the first one to start with a story. Um, I started my professional career as a naval officer. And in the Navy, I followed a lot of Navy procedures and had certain expectations. In my first job out of the Navy, in my first assignment, within probably 5 or 6 weeks of getting there, there was an employee who I found stealing from the company. And I terminated his employment. I was subsequently, or the company was subsequently sued for an improper termination. And to make a long story short, this guy who actually stole from the company got a payout from the insurance company of $17,000 because he was terminated. And despite my protestations to that, it was cheaper for the insurance company and the company to just pay this guy rather than go through the dynamics of litigation on it, because the company didn't have the right procedures and manuals. There was no manual that said that somebody couldn't borrow company equipment, and there was no procedure that indicated that this guy was, illegally or illicitly borrowing this computer equipment that he took. And as a result, he prevailed and got money. And it was, to me, an eye opener. And from that day forward, and subsequently going to law school and advising companies and defending companies in various litigation, I've realized that it's not hard to put together an employee manual, and it's a must-have. Right? It is an absolute must-have. Now, we can help at Honest Law. We can help with this. This is not an expensive endeavor, but it can be very expensive if you don't do it. An employee manual, when I look at an employee manual, it has a lot of benefits for the company. You say, why do you want to have a manual? Well, I kind of boil it down to, 5 things that you're going to want to do in an employee manual. First, you're going to want to state your mission and your values and your vision. Why is this company in existence, or this organization in existence? What's its mission? What's its vision? And that's very helpful as a recruiting tool as well for people you want to bring aboard. Secondly, you want to communicate expectations and policies. You are an employee of the company. We expect this out of you. And that can be anything from the code of conduct on things such as a dress code and grooming to attendance, etc. Third, it allows you to have consistency in the enforcement. How can it be good for one and not for another if you do something differently? Well, you can point back to a manual and say, well, this is our policy, and we're consistent in the way that we apply it. Fourth, and from a legal perspective, this is where I get it. It minimizes your risks, and minimizes your risks of getting sued, and it also minimizes your risks from a business perspective in paying unemployment or enhanced unemployment compensation, because you may terminate somebody legitimately under the policies that you have. And then say, that they shouldn't get unemployment compensation. And then when that's challenged, you have a policy and you have documentation of why that's the case. And then fifth, it can help limit conflict in the workplace, because, back to those expectations, it's not just the expectations of the individual, but of the team. And therefore, you can, limit conflict. So, they're kind of the reasons. I could also go through, if you'd like, some of the elements that I think you should put in a manual.
Yeah, go ahead. I think it'd be helpful.
Okay, so, I think that when you look at the elements, you could do this, we could do this for you, you could go online, but I really think that it makes sense to get some legal review as a minimum to make sure that, your policies pass muster. So I would say you have to have a code of conduct. I've mentioned this. What's the dress code? What's the grooming standards? What's the attendance required? Can you work remotely? If you do work remotely, what are the policies associated with that? Are there safety issues? I mean, certain businesses have certain ways where it's important that you follow safety compliance. So that should be in there. Second, each manual should have a communication policy. Is it okay to just knock on a CEO's door and say, I'm upset with something? Or are you supposed to follow a chain of command? Is it okay to post on social media, this company sucks? Or is it okay to complain to the entire staff by email of something that, your supervisor did to you? So the answer in many of those cases is no, you're not supposed to do that, but you need to have a communication policy. And that communication policy should also have elements of anti-harassment, in the way that you communicate with someone. It should not be in a manner that is harassing. Third, very importantly, and I think we're all in tune with this, is there has to be some non-discrimination policy that's in your book. There are legal bases where you can't discriminate on age, color, religion, pregnancy status, disability, etc. But there are other areas where you may wish to say that you're not going to discriminate against. There's no law that says you can't discriminate against blondes over brunettes, but maybe, hair color should be, something that you don't discriminate on the basis of. There are many things that your company values can come into play. And talk about why, you should judge people on the basis of their performance and not on their, personal characteristics. A fourth area, really important, is compensation and benefits. And that's everything. Do I get paid on jury duty? What is my bereavement leave if a member of my family dies? What sort of benefit waiting periods do I have for certain, retirement plan benefits, etc.? What about vacation policy? Are there limits on vacation or paid time off? What about sick time? Is there an accrual for these things? Is it automatic? So all of these comp and benefits, including how often you pay, etc., should be listed out so that the expectations are clear. When you have clear expectations that you've communicated, you limit the ability to have conflict. Fifth, really important one, I'd say, is your new hire policy and your separation policy. So bringing people aboard, or letting them go, or them resigning. In the Navy, we used to call this hail and farewell. You need to have those hail and farewell policies. What are you going to do with a new hire? Are they going to need to be certified or trained or go through a checklist, et cetera, to make sure they're competent to do certain things before they do it? On the separation, are there things they have to turn in? Is there a key, a badge, something, a fob, a computer, et cetera, that has to be turned in? What are the policies on that? And then finally, every manual needs to have an acknowledgement. Say, okay, I read this. I agree. I'm signing it now. And, that's one of the documents when we get to talking about personnel files that I would keep a copy of those acknowledgements.
This is great. It goes even beyond just avoiding litigation, just running a less stressful business.
Yeah.
It'd be important to have these employee manuals in. And so as far kind of on the subject of manuals, do you need separate sexual harassment policies?
I think it's a good idea to have separate sexual harassment policies and training. It doesn't hurt to have training. There are companies that do that. There are law firms that can put together something for you. You can get something online. In the companies I've run, I've always had a separate acknowledgement page associated with sexual harassment and zero tolerance for that. I think that's a good practice. So I think in all of these things, it's about taking a look at what the best practices are. And the best practices typically are those that also minimize your business risk and your legal risk.
Okay. And so there are federal and state laws on wages. Like what should an employer be worried about?
So, the federal laws from the Department of Labor, the FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act, are pretty basic. It's a lot of states have significantly enhanced laws beyond them. But as a minimum, you want to take a look at in your state minimum wage, overtime rules, record keeping rules, youth employment. Is a 16-year-old okay to work? Is a 15-year-old okay to work? If so, what are the rules associated with that? What hours? I live in Maryland, and for my own kids, that when they've had jobs, we've had to take a look at like how many hours they're allowed to work, and whether it's on a school night, etc. And so you got to take a look at those state rules. Overtime is typically, mandated at 1.5 times the hourly wage when people get over 40 hours per week. I think some people don't realize that overtime limits can kick in on a daily basis in certain states. If you work more than X hours on a day in certain states, you've got to be paid overtime, regardless of whether you're going to be at 40 hours a week. There are employers that think that 40-hour a week is based, if your payroll is every 2 weeks, that means 80 hours in 2 weeks. Well, it isn't that way. If you work 45 hours one week and 35 hours the other, 80 hours over 2 weeks, and you say, okay, you've worked your 80 hours in 2 weeks. Well, nope, you got to pay overtime on the 5 in the first week, unless they're in certain professions where, like nursing, where so there's a lot of nuances in the rules, and you got to know what the rules are. It's like playing any game, play Monopoly, you got to know the rules. You don't, you're going to pay the price potentially. The same in wage and employment law. You gotta know the rules. So read them, get a lawyer to advise you on them, or hire an HR professional that knows them, so that you can have policies in your company for these. And this goes from companies that are one employee to thousands of employees. You've got to follow the rules. Now there are differences in the rules for a certain number of employees. So, for example, the Family Medical Leave Act and other issues have different buckets of protection for employees depending on company size. So they're among the things that you've got to pay attention to. The other thing that's really important, ultimately people tend to leave a job at some point. They resign, they retire, or they get terminated. So if they do, what are your requirements to pay them? I remember back in my first company, I had an employee in California, and I had started a small subsidiary of my company in California, and I didn't know that California was so different from the other states. So my typical policy had been that when an employee was terminated, they'd get paid in the normal course in the next payroll, basically the bulk of their pay and any paid time off that they were due. Well, in California, that's not the law. In California, the law is that you've got to pay them at the time of separation. And they can sue you for every single day. So that, let's say you fire somebody on a Monday, and the payroll isn't that Friday, but the Friday hence, right? So you've got, in many states, it'd be fine to pay them their final pay on that Friday. Well, in California, you are now, 10 days late. You might be subject to end up paying them triple what they would have been owed, because you're getting a penalty for every single day that you haven't paid them.
Wow.
So these are the kinds of things that you've got to know. If you're going to employ people in different states, you've got to know the nuances of each of the state laws.
Okay. And like that's a very interesting point. And for our final question here, I want to know, because I know you have to head off, how long should I keep personnel files and what should be in them?
Well, that's a really good question too, because there's all sorts of laws for different parts of what's in a payroll. A personnel file, I should say, and a personnel file typically has the personnel file records and then the payroll records. So if you go to the EEOC says 1 year, but the payroll tax stuff, you've got to keep 4 years. The ERISA stuff, you've got to keep 6 years. If there's medical things in there, like they've requested some sort of medical leave, you may have to keep that for 30 years. So my advice typically to companies is don't get rid of them. You know, there's really there's no need to dispose of these records. In fact, what you should do instead is have an audit every year to make sure your active and then your inactive personnel files are up to date. So as a minimum, in your active personnel files, you've got to have an I-9 showing they have a legal right to work in the United States. You should have basic things like their application, their resume, any verifications you did, any checklists they completed, promotions, awards, any disciplinary action, etc. You want to keep these documents, and you want to audit them on an annual basis to make sure that you're in compliance, and that if somebody ever needs these records for any regulatory or legal reason, you've got them and you've got them organized. And we could help you provide a checklist of what you should have in the document, in the files, and how long you should keep them. And I think that's a good area for some sort of legal annual checkup to make sure that you are in compliance.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your time. And any closing thoughts?
So, no, Ahmad, it's been great talking to you today, even though it's kind of a dry topic, but it's a dry topic that can turn into a topic that's not so dry if you don't, follow the rules and the guidelines. So I'd encourage everyone in any business, to do an annual checkup on their personnel policies and records, and you'll save a lot of grief in the long run.
Thank you so much. You have a good day.
You too.